Hi, it's Chris Watkin here, and I'm with Bob Scarff, the ex-managing director of the whole of the UK Countrywide and now MD of Callwell. Bob, I'd like to talk to you about your story from trainee neg to MD to running Callwell, the challenges that you have had in those years, the mental health issues you've had in that time, what you've learned from it, so everyone else could learn your story. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Talk to me. Right. When did you first think that you wanted to be an estate agent?
About 10 years after I started,
So how did you fall into estate agency, Bob?
I
And
was
when?
1978,
Okay.
and I was planning to go to university to become a car designer. I didn't get the A-level grades that I needed. Had nothing to do. My mum spotted an advert for a trainee sales negotiator in December of 77. I went for an interview, got the job, and started in January
So
78.
you kind of fell in. And where was that?
Stony Stratford in Milton Keynes,
Oh, right.
which is where I now live, which
Lovely.
is an interesting.
Everything comes back
Yeah, it
round,
does.
doesn't it? And did you enjoy it straight away?
I enjoyed the money straight away,
Okay.
because it was very quickly I learned that I was able to earn so much more than any of my friends were. But yes, I did fall in love fairly early on with this ability that I seem to have to help people find houses. Estate agency was different in the late 70s and early 80s, far less regulated than now, far less competition than now. Whether or not it's more fun, I mean, a lot of people of my generation would say that it was more fun then. I don't know whether that's true or not. It was different, but I certainly found, I felt myself very fortunate to have found something that I seemed to be very good at and that paid very well. And it was the money that beat about it. It was the money that I fell in love with before I fell in love with
Do
property.
you think that was indicative of estate agency in the late 70s and early 80s? That it attracted, no one really went into estate agency, but when you kind of fell in, you became addicted to
Yes,
it.
yeah, absolutely. The people I worked with then came from all sorts of different walks of life. There were people, I mean, I was 18, 19 years of age. There were people working for me, working with me that were a lot older than that, who had all sorts of different careers.
Okay.
And I think you're right. It's one of those things that you didn't think of as yourself as being an estate agent, but suddenly you found yourself doing it, and you were actually quite good at it.
Okay, so the next step up from trainee neg is valuer. How long before you were
Not
up?
in my day, no.
No?
Because multi-listing was far more prevalent then. So winning the instruction in the first place was far less of a priority, because everybody had it really. Even if the agent across the road had got it, you could still knock on the door and get a viewing and get a fee. So winning the instruction wasn't anything like as the be-all and end-all that it became over the following years. So anybody and everybody went out to value and list houses.
Okay, so your job primarily was to basically sell the houses, and if you didn't have it, you'd go door knocking.
Yeah,
How long have?
and that is how it was in the late 70s and early 80s.
Do you think it was the Estate Agents Act 79 that changed everything then?
No, not particularly. I mean, the Estate Agents Act never really delivered all of the things that it said that it was going to deliver when it was first mooted. When I first joined the industry, that everybody was talking about that, and it never ever turned out to be everything that it was turned out that it was mooted to be. The only thing that it definitely dealt with back in those days was agents deliberately buying properties themselves without telling the vendor who was really buying it. That was very prevalent in the 70s and presumably in the 60s as well.
So, when did you end up running your own branch then? Or
Within
was there a,
18
or was there a
within 18
valuer?
No,
rolled into it?
no. I went straight from trainee neg to manager within 18 months.
Same branch.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Toaster in Northamptonshire.
Okay.
Which is closed now.
So, how old were you when you made branch manager then?
21.
Okay. Now, a 21-year-old branch manager, it will be probably, it'd still be 79, 80, won't it?
Yeah, 81. Yeah, 80, 81. Yeah.
Okay. Number one, how it's quite difficult to go through the ranks up to management in the same branch that you came in as trainee neg. How
Yeah.
did the other staff
Not well.
cope with that?
Not well at all.
Okay.
And most of the management lessons that I went on to apply to my benefit and to the benefit of others, and most of the training I've ever done over the years was based on the mistakes that I made in that 18-month period. Because I was trying hard still to be the mate of the two guys that were working with me, because that's how we were. But I was also trying to be their boss. Um, and there was lots and lots of things I learned about how not to do it during that period of time.
What share with the guys out there? What lessons did you learn about, that going through the ranks?
Well, I don't. I think the biggest mistake I made, and I made it a second time when I became an area manager, and I definitely learnt it properly then, was that you don't treat everybody precisely the same. Yes, you have to have an element of uniformity, and you have to respect that they've all got jobs of equal rank. But when I first started, everybody had to. My way of motivating, my way of telling off, my praise and my reprimand had to be completely uniform. I couldn't cut some slack for one person without cutting the same slack with everybody. And I learned eventually that that's not how it works, and that you need to have the confidence in your own ability to be different with each person, to be the person that's going to get the best out of them, because that's all that matters at the end of the day.
Okay. What about being friends with? You said earlier on when you were at Toaster, that you'd gone through the ranks and your colleagues all of a sudden you become the manager. What difficulties did you go through with that?
Simply that I should never have done it. I mean, I should have. They should have. I seem to think that if I at 8 o'clock at night when the office is closed, which is what we did in those days, suddenly we'd go down the pub and I could flick a switch, and because I could flick that switch, I thought they were doing the same thing. So I could flick from being their boss to being their mate, because in my head that was easy to do, and it still is. I can still completely draw a black and white difference between my work life and my private life, but they couldn't. And I think that's again the biggest lesson from all of that is that it's what they think that matters, not what you think.
Okay, so how long were you a branch manager at Toaster for then?
3-4 years.
Okay, and things go well there?
Very well. And in those days, again, competition was far less. We only had, I think there was us and 2 other agents in Toaster, whereas now there's probably 7 or 8. The town is a lot larger, to be fair. But yes, it went well. I became an area manager fairly early on, but in truth, I was more like. It's probably better to draw the analogy that the role of a branch manager was more that nowadays of a senior negotiator, and that the role of an area manager was more akin to a branch manager in terms of the number of people that I was responsible for. Because the people that were running the branches then were fairly junior people. So I was, in management terms, in management style and skill, I used the skills that when I was an area manager that probably a branch manager would use nowadays. I was an area manager for however many years that was, and I eventually ended up. But by this time, of course, Taylor's had been bought out by Bairstow Eaves plc, that became then part of Countrywide plc in 1986. So by the end of the 80s, I was deputy managing director of what was then a 60 branch business from Bristol to Milton Keynes.
So you would have been in your late 20s,
Yeah,
pretty senior role,
Yeah.
responsible
Yeah.
for how many branches?
well, half of the 60,
Okay.
30 branches.
Okay, what skills did you need to, when you're at the front line day to day coaching your colleagues in the branch, what skills did you need and have to learn to basically remote manage offices?
Well, by the time I was deputy managing director, I had area managers working for me who were then responsible for the branches on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
So my skills, such as they were at the time, they were developed in that time, was getting the best out of the people that reported to me, and visiting the branches and talking to the people in the branches, not as their manager, but as someone, if you will, checking up that what I had been told about the situation at a branch is true on a day-to-day basis.
Were the area managers that were reporting to you of the same age or younger, or were there some of them older?
Obviously, that changed as years went by. At that time, they would have been older, probably.
And how did those area managers feel that they were in their 30s, that someone in their mid-late 20s was telling them what to do?
Well, because I've always looked a lot older than I really am, that never really cropped up as an issue. I always felt that if I ever did anything to remind them that I was in my 20s, then that would be a problem. But because I never did, because I treated them increasingly as the years went by, increasingly better, it never really cropped up. The most interesting thing, the best example of it is that when I moved to Birmingham in 91 at the age of 32 to become managing director of a 40 branch business, with the state agency, financial services, auctions, new homes, our own accounts department, a proper standalone business, very comparable with a 40 branch independently owned business nowadays. I was the youngest person at 32. I was the youngest member of the management team, and I think because I didn't do anything to make them think that I was anything other than just a very good manager of them, my age never came into it.
So you were in your early 30s. You were running. We're in the early 90s now. What were your hopes and dreams going forward? Because you had another 30 years left working. What did you want from life at that point?
Gosh, there's a question. I didn't think it was going to end up the way that it did. If I'm completely honest, at that stage, it probably wasn't something that was occupying my every waking moment. I was concentrating more on.
Had you got kids, family, and children at this point?
Yes, I've got 3 kids or 2 and 1 on the way. They're all at school, and I was concentrating very much on just earning enough money to pay the mortgage, pay the school bills, etc.
Were you enjoying the job?
Oh, enormously. I mean, that was probably the job I did between 91 and 97. Was probably the most enjoyable. Close second to my time when I was managing director of the estate agency division as a whole, but my most enjoyable time.
Why was it enjoyable?
Because it was the mix between. I was still close enough to the shop floor to still, when I was on branch visits, to pick up the phone and deal with stuff. I still knew enough about the market that I felt comfortable answering a customer's phone call or dealing with a customer when they came in without making their experience worse. As my job moved on, although I still would sometimes pick up the phone on a branch visit if nobody else was picking it up, just to prove a point, I very often caused more trouble than it was worth because I couldn't answer a single question that the person was quite reasonably asking me. But when I was running the business in Birmingham, that wasn't the case at all. So it was, and I really felt that was probably the most significant moment in my career where I was fully and absolutely responsible for a specific unit of business. It was all down to me. It was almost like it was called Bob Scarff rather than Dixon's. And I think the people that, and there are still a few around who worked there then in those days, would say that that's what they felt. They worked for me and my family business rather than working for Hambro Countrywide.
Did you have any fears or frustrations at this point in time? We're still in the early 90s. You're still responsible.
I'm still concentrating on just doing a good job. And I think the pinnacle of that was probably about 95, 96, where we won, the company won an internal award, which was awarded to the most profitable subsidiary. There was only 13 or 14 subsidiaries at this time. And when I took over, we were penultimate, last but one in that league. And within 3-4 years, we were top. So I'd been completely consumed by that. And you mentioned about mental illness. It's one of those topics. You interviewed somebody recently when you talked about this, and you said it's a touchy subject. And I think that's half the trouble, because people do think of it as a touchy subject, and actually it shouldn't be. A lot of people talk about, when they're talking about underperformance of staff, they talk about their attitude, they talk about, it's all about mental awareness. It's all about concentrating on what's between the ears. Yet when it comes to having a serious conversation about that, people seem to shy away from it. And that's why, to come back to your question, what happened for me in about 96, 97, I had become so consumed with just making a success of Dixon's, that having got it to where I got it, and then having not got a clear plan of what I was going to do next, it all started to go wrong for me, in my head at least.
Was it actually going wrong in the business?
No, absolutely not. The week that I left Dixon's, which was in May 97, we just had our world record net fees result that week, and I can't remember what the numbers were now, but I remember thinking, This is this is about going out on a high. I haven't left a dying business. I've left a very, very good business.
But you had some demons in your head.
Yeah, I just couldn't. I could see what was coming. Looking back on it, I was very stressed. I wasn't talking to anybody about it, which I should have done. Didn't even talk to my wife about it. I kept it all to myself. Kept it all bottled up, all classic stuff. And something, I can't even remember what it was, but something happened on a particular day that was it. The straw that broke the camel's back. And I went and saw the boss, Harry Hill, who, and I'd say this to his face, he didn't deal with it in a modern, touchy-feely, let's sit down and talk about this kind of way. But what he did do was just make sure that he wasn't going to lose me, because he knew I was a successful member of his team. And his motives were probably more about keeping me employed than they were anything else.
So what did you say to him?
I told him I'd had enough and I'd got to leave. That's it. I'm a failure. I've got to go. I'm letting you
But
down.
you weren't a failure.
In my head I was.
Why did you think you were a failure?
Because I couldn't see how I was going to carry on working at such an intensity. I mean, don't ask me to rationalise it. It's completely irrational. In my head, I'd taken this business as far as I could take it. I couldn't fathom how I was going to carry on working as hard as this.
How old were you at this point?
28, 29.
Okay.
29.
So this is 96, 97?
97, yeah.
Okay. What did your wife think about all this?
She only knew about it after it had happened.
Did she think everything was rosy in the garden? Just you had a 28, 29-year-old husband providing for the family, working too many hours, and then all of a sudden, poof. Did she see it coming?
She would say that he's always a miserable so-and-so that takes his work too seriously anyway, so I never noticed the difference. And that would probably be a fair assessment. So no, would she have done anything different? Could anybody have done anything different? I suspect not. All I really needed to do was talk to somebody. Could have been her, could have been my boss, could have been anybody, could have been a mate, but I just didn't. I just bottled it up inside, and I think that's why from that day to this, I've always made sure that when I've been one-to-oneing with a line report of mine, not just if I've seen any warning signals, but just as a routine, I always make sure that we talk about them before we talk about the business. The number of times that people talk about, I do one-to-ones with my staff. Then when you ask them about what they actually talk about, it's all about numbers. It's never about the individual and how they're feeling. And the big question I like asking people, even to this day, am I getting the best out of you? Are you working well under my stewardship? And get the person to talk about themselves. But to come back to the Harry Hill point, because I must button this off. His answer was, take a few weeks off, come back when you're ready, and I'll have something for you to do. And that's actually, although it wasn't, as I say, as touchy-feely and as constructed as it might be nowadays, that's exactly what I needed. I just needed time off. And as it happened, had I have taken that time off and had gone back to doing the job I was doing in the first place, it probably would have been okay. But in the meantime, this was at the very, very beginning of Hambro Countrywide conveyancing, as it was then called. So we set this business up in 97. It was going like a train very, very quickly, but it didn't have enough management in it. They had lawyers in it, but didn't have any business managers in it. Okay. So Harry gave me the job of running that for the next 18 months, and that sort of helped me rehabilitate myself.
So what lessons do you think the area managers and the divisional directors could learn from your instances of...
I think if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody.
Okay.
And I'm also living proof that just because something like that happens, it doesn't mean the end of your career. You can go on to still be very successful. In fact, I would say I'm more successful because I went through that experience. If you're the manager of somebody, if you think something's not right with one of your team, it probably isn't, because people are sending you signals deliberately, so pick up on them. But even if you're not seeing signals, always give somebody the opportunity to talk about themselves and how they're getting on. And if you're being managed by somebody, help your line manager, make it easy for your line manager to have that conversation with you. But if that doesn't work, have that conversation with somebody. Have it with your husband or wife, your boyfriend or girlfriend, your vicar, your mate, whatever, but have it with somebody.
Aren't they a bit too close to the coalface? I
Who?
mean, if you talk to your boss, some people will be afraid to
Yeah, I
open
get
up
that.
to their boss.
I get that. I shouldn't. I didn't think of it like that. And
That
actually,
took some balls to do, didn't it? To go to Harry Hill and basically say, look, I'm not enjoying this.
well, no, because I actually was going to resign. So in my head, I was taking the coward's way out. There wasn't brave at all. I thought, that's it. I've had enough. I've got to go. I'm driving down to wherever it was in Essex at the time to resign. That's it. So I was driving my company car down there. I was thinking, this is the last time I'm going to be driving this car. I was gone. I was done.
And Harry knew that.
No, it came as a big surprise to him.
Yeah, but did he know when you walked through the door, I'm resigning?
I'm sure my body language would have screamed it at him. You can normally tell, can't you?
Yes, you
if
can.
someone's got something to talk to you about that's serious,
Okay.
you can pick up on it fairly quickly.
Do you think it's the responsibility as you as the person to tell your boss, or do you think it's the responsibility of the boss to notice their
I
staff?
think it's both. I think each dynamic is different, but I think the manager needs to make it part of their responsibility. But the person that's suffering this anxiety, stress, whatever it is, also has a responsibility to themselves and to their loved ones to not just hide behind it.
I mean, you said you thought you were a failure. What going back before you went down and you were handing your notice in, what do you think you could have done differently yourself?
Simply just talk to somebody. I know it sounds simple, and I keep coming back to the same thing, but that's all I really needed to do. Even when I was sitting there talking to Harry about it, I was feeling better straight away.
Do you think quite often it's just as easy as that? Do you think we're too guilty of bottling it all up?
It was as easy as that for me, because all I was guilty of was bottling things up. But I realised there are other forms of mental illness which afflict people from time to time, which have to be treated with medication, have to be treated with far more serious remedies than taking a few days off. For me,
It was almost like a reset switch for you, wasn't it?
For me, it was, yes.
Do you think it was because? Do you think as the years have gone by, we as an industry have got even more intense, especially when we're dealing with large chains and corporates, and we're going to talk about that later in a different video. Do you think the corporates? Because let's be honest, by the nature of the corporates, there's a hierarchy. Do you think do you think the corporates do their bit on mental illness?
Well, actually, a big company, whether they're corporately owned or independently owned, has more of the resources, and so therefore they should have less excuse for not dealing with it. In a business the size of Countrywide, we could afford to have managers, and we could afford to train those managers well, so that they were alive to those risks. So I think that the larger companies, whoever owns them, should look at themselves as being a more secure employer. But that's not to say that at the lower end of the scale, the smaller business doesn't have a responsibility as well. It's all about, ironically, it's about getting the best out of your people. And that, whoever owns the business that you work for, it boils down to a relationship between two people.
What about going to their boss?
That's a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, if you... I know that when I was somebody's boss's boss's boss, that if I had a phone call out of the blue or an email or a text message or something, somebody turned up at my office, that they would, somebody would come to me in desperation because they couldn't get anywhere with anybody else. I knew I would deal with that sensitively. I knew I would deal with it appropriately and professionally without siding with anybody. But I'm not sure that there's that many people around in that kind of position who would have that kind of attitude. Frankly, my attitude is born completely out of what I went through in '97. I think it actually made me a better manager of people because of that experience. So it's a tough call. I once had a conversation with somebody who worked for, as it happens, a large corporate. I said something. I said quite seriously to this person, "Well, why don't you talk to your boss's boss?" And they just laughed at me because they thought I was making a joke, and I wasn't. I was making a serious point. Unless you speak to your boss's boss, you'll never know the truth of it. But she knew that if she spoke to her boss's boss, that would be the end of her career.
Okay, so let's come back on to your journey. We're now into you spent 18 months at the conveyancing. So we now go back in. We're now into the early 2000s. You're in your early 30s. What happened in the 2000s then?
When was it? I came out of conveyancing at the end of '98, and I then became what was called a divisional director, and I was responsible for 6 or 7 individual subsidiary companies from Scotland down to Bristol, taking in my old patch, the Midlands and Manchester and the Northwest. I did that job for 4 or 5 years. Countrywide got bigger overnight in 2004 when we bought the Bradford and Bingley chain. And at that time, suddenly the part of the country that I was responsible for was itself a lot larger. I think my job title might have changed, but fundamentally I was still looking after a third or a half of the country. We had a new chief executive join Countrywide in 2006. And although his successor gets lots of press about the number of people that she got rid of, what gets sometimes overlooked is that Grenville, when he came in 2006, also got rid of quite a lot of people as well. But I think the difference is that he replaced them with people that knew what they were doing in the jobs that he wanted done. Certainly in my case, he promoted me rather than getting rid of me. And I ended up by then 2008, I ended up doing the job then that I was then doing until I left.
So basically, you were in charge of every single estate agency branch in Countrywide, 800 branches, 6,000 people.
We dealt with Hamptons and John D. Wood in a slightly different way because they are different.
Yes.
The way things are done in London is different, and the staff are certainly different. So although I had some involvement with both of those businesses, they weren't my direct responsibility. Okay. So every brand outside of those two, all of the estate agency staff, the new home staff, the financial services staff, 850 branches, 6,000-ish employees and 650 mortgage advisors.
Did you enjoy it?
Enormously. As I said earlier, not quite as much as I enjoyed the job in Birmingham. Ironically, that was the one that gave me stress, but I was enjoying it. But I loved every minute of it. I mean, I won't say it was easy, because just thinking about what was going on in 2008, I was given the chalice just at the wrong moment. It was the job I'd always wanted, and I've now got it. And my first task was more about closing branches and making people redundant than it was anything else. But
is that the worst part of the job, making people redundant?
Yeah, it has to be, because it's just waste, isn't it? I mean, I reconcile it on the basis that all I was trying to undo was the mistakes that had probably have been made, by me included, in previous years. When things were good, you tend always to look at, you put your efforts into increasing the revenue than you necessarily do at cutting the costs. And it's easy to do when actually that is probably the best return on an hour's time is best spent on revenue versus costs. But we probably didn't spend enough time looking at the costs. And so a large chunk of what I was doing in that first year was getting rid of management layers that should never have been allowed to exist. But I was part of that problem as well. But of course, you've suddenly now got the marketplace had completely changed. Our revenue and our pipeline was going south very quickly. We had no choice. Show me somebody who enjoys closing branches and enjoys making people redundant, and I'll show you someone that's not really in their heart an estate agent, because you have to love people and love what they do to really get the best out of them and yourself.
So 2008, 2009, how old were you at this point?
40.
So you were running the vast majority of the country. 08, 9, 10, things are starting to get a little bit better. Where did you want to take? Where was the next step for Bob Scarff? Was there another step?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'd
got, for the first time, this is the irony with what happened in the end, for the first time in about 2012, 13, I'd got a much clearer plan of where I was going to go. I was committed to staying with Countrywide, whereas if I'm honest, even when I was running the business in Birmingham, and even when I was doing the divisional director's job, a little bit of me still wanted to set up my own business. A little bit of me still wanted to see whether I could do this myself. And those feelings finally disappeared in somewhere around 2012, 2013.
And you genuinely thought that right, I want the CEO of Countrywide.
No, I felt, well, as it's turned out, of course, I wouldn't have made as big a pig's ear of it as the person who did get the job. So maybe I should have had that as an aspiration, but I didn't. I felt that the job for me was running the estate agency, financial services, and lettings business all as one, because at that stage, lettings and sales were two separate businesses.
And were you saying to the board, give me lettings, give me lettings?
I was saying it to my boss. I wasn't saying it to the board.
Okay. If
No.
you don't mind saying, there's an awful lot of layers at this point, wasn't there?
No, there was a PLC board.
Yes.
And then there's an executive board.
Okay.
And I sat on the executive board. So the day-to-day management decisions were made by the executive, and my relationship with my line manager was exceptionally good.
So your line manager at this point was
Grenville
Turner. So when did Grenville go?
2014.
2014. Were you ever offered the big job, Grenville's job?
No, I never applied for it. I should have done, looking back on it. But I probably wouldn't have got it because I think a decision had already been made by the PLC board that it was going to go to an external candidate,
Okay.
Which it did. But there was 2 or 3 people on the executive board. One, of course, who is now the group managing director, Paul Creffield. 2 or 3 people sitting on that executive board who I thought could do the job better than me, and I'd still say that now. And I was very happily served. If Paul had become group chief executive, then I'd still be at Countrywide now, because I'd be very happy to serve him as the leader of the estate agency, financial services, etc.
Did you think when you always go to the top job, you're dealing with the city and not necessarily your guys in the front line?
That's one of the things that would have held me back. A, because of my lack of experience,
Okay.
And B, frankly, my appetite for dealing with that kind of thing.
Okay.
I'm much more of a hands-on person.
So you left Countrywide in 2015.
Yeah,
Did you walk or were you let go?
I was let go.
Because there was quite a few that were, some big names in there.
I was the first.
Okay.
But to be fair, Nick Dunning and I happened on the same day. So he was the guy that ran the lettings business, who's now got a very successful lettings business of his own, well, lettings and sales business of his own. And we both went on the same day or within 24 hours of each other, because I think the new chief executive, Alison Platt, had decided that we'd all got to go and she'd got to start somewhere, so she might as well start with the biggest names, if you will. It was a perfectly, don't get me wrong, it's a perfectly civil conversation. I mean, she told me she didn't want me around anymore, in effect. We agreed to terms, and I happily walked out.
How did it make you feel?
Mixed feelings. I mean, very, very sorry to be leaving. If I'm honest, had I have known how many other people were also going to be turfed out or would walk out themselves, I might have felt different. I just saw me going as her rearranging a bit of the furniture at the top so she could make some changes down below. And actually, I was as full of excitement for what it.
Did you know what you wanted to do?
No, and that was the thing that excited me.
How old were you at this point?
15? 47.
Okay.
46, 47. No, what am I talking about? 56, 57. I was 60 last year.
Okay.
I'm 60 now, so whatever that is. 57.
Yeah, about 50.
Anyway.
Mid-50s.
And I was as excited about the future as anything, because I knew that for the first time in my working life, I'd got all sorts of options. I was fortunate that financially, because the business had gone through a privatisation and then gone public again in 2013, that financially I'd done reasonably well out of that. And so therefore I didn't need to rush into something else. And so I didn't, and I took my time out. And on a personal level, one of the best things that's ever happened to me is being kicked out of Countrywide in 2015.
Do you think they cut out too many people? Because there was a bit of a cull, wasn't there?
Well, of course, a load of stuff went on that I don't know about, but all I see is what everybody else sees.
There's some big names.
Yeah, people walking out, people being kicked out, and all I can say is that putting the business in the hands of a chief executive without industry experience is not of itself a mistake. but allowing that person to surround themselves in turn with people who also didn't know the industry, and to therefore treat people in the way that they did, to the point where they either were sacked, made redundant, or resigned. It was probably the summer of, I don't know, 2016. They did a big reorganisation, I think, in the September of 2016, and I think for me that was when the rot really set in, because they lost a lot of very, very good people. Now there's still a lot of very good people there,
Yes.
but they lost a lot of good people in that time, and I think that above all that betrays a lack of understanding by those people that were making those decisions of what estate agency management is all about, because you can't lose that many good players and still expect to win as many games as you were before.
So you were on the beach, probably kicking your heels in 15 or 16. What made you get involved with Callwell?
That was also by luck. I mean, at that time, I would have, if you'd have met me, if you'd have interviewed me then, I would tell you that I was intent on setting up my own estate agency. That itch still hadn't actually gone away, and that I was going to have my own little business, and it was going to be very successful, and it was either going to be in Milton Keynes or in Birmingham, two areas I know better than anywhere else.
What, yourself, or do almost like a Nick Dunning, get other people's money and plough it in?
I wouldn't have done it quite like he has, partly because he has far better connections than I do in the world of private equity, and he was able to secure funding to do a very ambitious plan that in a way that I probably wouldn't have been quite so successful at. And in any event, I didn't want it to be that big. I wanted it to just be me and half a dozen people.
It'd been fun, wouldn't it?
Exactly, and it almost didn't matter. Well, it would have mattered to me clearly if it had been unsuccessful, but that wasn't the main driver for me. The main driver was to have some fun. I then met a guy called Rob Wellstead. In fact, I was introduced. Rob and I were introduced to each other by Peter Rollings, ex-Marsh and Parsons, at, I think it would have been the Sunday Times Awards conference of 2015, so December of 2015. And Peter introduced us by saying that, Bob, this is Rob. Rob knows everything there is to know about lettings. Rob, this is Bob. He knows everything that there is to know about sales. You should talk to each other. And that's what we did. And at that stage, it was still most probable that we were going to try and do something together around sales and lettings. But I then discovered in his business this thing called Callwell, which he had invented for himself, for his own use, which was born out of the frustration that he had of his own staff not dealing with email inquiries properly. Somebody walks in, we deal with them. Somebody phones up, we deal with them. But if they email, somehow we don't. So he had this wizard idea of making the email make the phone ring. And it was so much better than anything I'd ever seen anywhere before. I decided then that that's what he and I should do together. And so by the middle of 2016, we had hived that off into a separate business. He and I were 50-50 partners. We've put a shed load of cash into developing the product from what it was then to what it is now. In its heart, it still does the same thing, but it does lots of other stuff besides. And although for a little while I still had this itch, this nagging thing, why don't you set up your own estate agency, Bob? Actually, now I've decided, no, this is far more supplying an industry that I know and love. Is far more beneficial.
It's a very simple thing, isn't it, what Callwell does?
Very simple, yeah.
Yet very effective.
It's simply not got by a lot of people and simply got by a lot of other people. So it's very, very effective. At its heart, that's all it does, is turn your email into a phone call, so that within seconds of the email arriving, whether it's from Zoopla, Rightmove, your own website, Valpal, any source of email coming in, any customer inquiry, gets displayed on a separate dashboard. That in itself is a big advantage. All kinds of management information around what time of day your leads are coming in, etc. But the cutest thing it does is it makes the phone in the office ring. Somebody picks the phone up, they hear a recorded message that says, you have a Callwell lead from, and it reads out the name of the customer that's put their name in the email address. Press 1 to connect now. So if you want to talk to that customer, which the majority of ours do, then they'll press 1 and they're ringing that customer straight away. If they don't want to talk to them for whatever reason, they just put the phone down and the customer knows no different. But their manager, their boss, knows that that's what they did. And it's very easy then to start managing those people's activities. Well, why didn't you speak to that customer? And even if you were busy at that moment, why didn't you ring them back? Because you can do that as well 5 minutes later.
Are you happy?
Very.
Why are you happy?
Because I've got a work-life balance now in a way that I probably never dreamt I would ever have. As I said, I would still be at Countrywide, probably still loving it, but still suffering the stresses and strains of such a high-powered job and working the hours that I was working. Whereas now I can come and go as I please, within reason. I have another couple of business interests as well. I work when I want to work. And I think at its heart, the reason I can say with such conviction that I'm happy is that I'm now only dealing with stuff that I enjoy dealing with. When you work for somebody else, particularly in a big job like that, quite a lot of what you end up spending your time on isn't stuff that you're really enjoying. It just has to be done by somebody, and it's your job to do it.
And what's the future for Bob Scarff?
Well, I'm 60 now. I don't feel that I'm going to be working past I'm 70, but I do think I'm still going to be working for the next 10 years. I can see us turning Callwell into something quite spectacular over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. I think we've really got something here. We've got a number of very large customers, and I think that's what I'm going to be putting my most effort into. I also half own a recruitment business that specialises in tech recruitment, and I think that's growing. And whilst it may not be quite the size that Callwell's going to be, that in itself will also be very successful.
Thank you for your time today, Bob.